Hello, this is Arlo Kilpatrick, the erudite Kynophile, and I just wanted to share with you some thoughts on a paper that I read called What, If Anything, is Wrong with Bestiality. This is a paper written by Levy, and it's an interesting paper. I highly recommend that you read it if you're interested at all in the subject of what bestiality is and why it might be permissible in a utilitarian form of ethics. I will be using a teleprompter through this since there's a lot of different material to go through and a lot of notes, and I will be following the paper closely through the rest of the video. So if you want to look at it, go right ahead. Well, I disagree with its conclusions for reasons I'll explain. It does refute some of the more fallacious arguments against the permissibility of bestiality, so I'll look at those first, followed by his argument that the taboo on bestiality is still rational. I'll be following the paper closely, but I'll add in my own commentary wherever I think it appropriate. First, bestiality is a perversion. This is often little more than an argument from an unpopularity, that the rarity of the practice and the disgust it produces in many individuals render it impermissible to all. But without a recognizable reason why this disgust is valid, it only serves to prevent the person who feels disgusted from participating in these activities, and does nothing to stop people with other inclinations other than adding some social stigma that makes it wise to hide these activities. Some lists of perversions are also demonstrably ridiculous as a measure of what's permissible in sex. For example, very hardline Catholics have for hundreds of years insisted that only heterosexual sex in the missionary position with the intention to produce children is non-perverse. By this standard, masturbation, recreational sex between consenting adults, oral sex, and other often harmless activities are deemed perverse. So one cannot call bestiality perverse and act as if that answers the question of why it is impermissible, as it just invents a new category to dodge the responsibility of an explanation of this position. Next, the issue of consent. I went over this in another video, so I'll be brief here, but basically the problem of this argument is that it assumes there is only one kind of consent used in daily life, the rational informed consent, which accompanies business decisions and many life-changing moments for people all over the world. But there is another form of consent, an emotional, behavioral kind, which is also used by both people and many higher animals. Although informed consent would be ideal in human sexual encounters, it is often this behavioral consent which is communicated between partners. Should we disallow those encounters? Most people would say no, and those who would say yes have a great deal of work to do in preventing people from expressing their natural instincts. These instincts are present in most vertebrates, and mammals especially, so that if this behavioral consent is good enough intraspecies, it's good enough interspecies as well if we can recognize the signs of consent. Some people may claim that pedophilia is permissible by the same argument, but there are other considerations which make it impermissible. Namely, the child will likely live to regret these sexual encounters, which can be quite traumatic, and will later be capable of informed consent as well, so we can imply the standard of informed consent to them and conclude that certain kinds of pedophilia are impermissible. We may argue over the exact limits, but I think we can safely conclude that some age limits are appropriate. There are some who would disagree with this, but that's an argument for another day. I don't really need to go into that now. The final refuted argument is the idea that bestiality wrongfully uses animals as a means rather than an end in themselves. This argument is also hypocritical, in that people who espouse it often have no problem using animals for food, entertainment, clothing, and other purposes besides sex. If we allow these uses as mere means, then sex isn't really all that different, and is in many ways better for the animal than the perpetual imprisonment and harvesting that accompany their agricultural and pet uses. I would argue that these benefits are the price of domesticating these creatures, giving them longer, healthier lives than they would have had in the wild, and that even in agriculture the animals can be an end as well as a means. Take as an example any county fair with prizes for the best pigs, cows, and other animals. These animals are well cared for, arguably better than any animal in the wild, and even if they die early, they are still, when raised properly, respected as fellow creatures. In sex, too, animals can be treated with respect and dignity, and thus can be treated as an end in themselves, particularly when effort is expended to ensure their pleasure as well as our own. So those three arguments are the main ones against bestiality, and it might now be appropriate to consider a possible counterexample, which seems to be equivalent to bestiality and still would be considered wrong by many people. In the case of permanently mentally handicapped children, there is no possibility of an adult mentality ever developing, and thus no possibility of informed consent. They might, however, still behaviorally consent to sex, and without the possibility of regret later on, what harm would come from sex with permanently mentally disabled children? Why would this be wrong and bestiality be permissible? Well, you can also appeal to the desires of the parents, for example, but here Levy uses an interesting virtue ethics argument that sex with mentally disabled people is still treating human beings as mere objects, and makes it that much easier to treat even the non-disabled as mere means, since the handicapped child looks and sounds mostly like an ordinary human being. Bestiality, on the other hand, doesn't have to use the animals as mere means. And even if it does, the same can be said for most of our dealings with domesticated species, so that if we object to bestiality on those grounds, we must also object to domestication itself, which is in many ways a symbiotic relationship between ourselves and other species. Thus, whether we're talking about consequentialist, Kantian, or virtue ethical grounds, bestiality is, at least in some cases, permissible. Consequentialist ethics render it permissible since it is relatively easy to have sex with animals without causing harm, and may in fact result in mutual pleasure for both man and beast. According to Kant, what gives people moral worth is that they are rational beings, and so in that system, there are no moral considerations in our dealings with animals. And in terms of virtue ethics, there is no evidence that bestiality somehow perverts or corrupts people in their relationships with animals or other humans, since we often treat them as ends as well as beings, even in our most trivial interactions, such as in play and feeding. Thus, there does not appear to be a moral problem with bestiality, but it still remains taboo for most people. Why is this? Well, according to one Peter Morris, bestiality is taboo because for most of human history, people viewed themselves as above or better than other animals, and sex erodes the supposed boundaries between them. Since all life seems to have some form of common ancestry, it is unlikely that humans are fundamentally different from other animals in a way that gives them higher value. The best one can do at this point is define a continuum of moral worth on the basis of cognitive or emotional ability or other neurological measures, and say that human beings lie on the high end of this spectrum, along with dolphins, chimps, elephants, and even dogs. Thus, we can treat both humans and other animals as moral equivalents in activities where we share common experiences, including sex. But Neil Levy wants to keep the taboo against bestiality, so he constructs a vague argument on the basis that human beings are defined by the limits they place on themselves, and that certain boundaries should not be crossed if we are to remain human in any meaningful sense. Now I think that such limits should all be examined, even those which would change everything about who we are. For instance, I'm a transhumanist, and I think if we had the technology to upload human consciousnesses onto a computer, those consciousnesses would no longer have a body, and would no longer be human in any meaningful sense, and yet would still likely have a life worth living. But he then dismisses bestiality as a lower limit of humanity without justification, simply due to the horrified reaction of the majority of people to it, and concludes that this is a boundary we must not cross. To this, I would respond that it is merely a disguised human-centric attitude, and that before we agree that we should not have sex with animals, it must be demonstrated that bestiality actually does have a negative impact on the identities of those who engage in it. If, for example, it could be demonstrated that people who commit bestiality have fewer or less close friends than those who do not, that would be a step in the right direction for this argument. As it stands, however, it's just speculation about the effects of bestiality on people, which we have already dismissed until further evidence is gathered. Levy acknowledges the weakness of this argument, in that the same standard applies to other lesser taboos. For example, one could make the argument that a defining limit of humanity is that men and women get married and have children, and that by this standard, homosexuality is socially deviant behavior and crosses boundaries which make the participants inhuman. He doesn't really have an answer as to why the taboo against homosexuality should be discarded, and the taboo against bestiality should remain, other than the idea that a significant portion of the population is homosexual, and penalizing them for this would have undesirable social consequences. Well, I'm sorry, but I don't view morality as a popularity contest, where once the number of people doing an activity reach a certain number, it should be allowed. Even if 99% of the people stole on a daily basis, stealing would still be wrong, and for good reasons. It may be that you would have a lot of work to do uh, to get that ban, but it would still be reasonable to ban. Arguments about the permissibility of any activity should, in principle at least, stand and fall on their own merits, and not be allowed simply because enough people do it. Besides, even if homosexuality or bestiality or whatever was somehow identity-threatening, having large numbers of people commit an identity-threatening act would have even more societal impact, with the result that more work would need to be done to stop it from wrecking the ideal human being we so desire. I'll leave off on this video with criteria by which bestiality could be demonstrated to be wrong. After all, I consider myself a minor scientist, so falsifiability is great for that. If it could be demonstrated that acts of bestiality, even if practiced in a consensual and cruelty-free way, were harmful to either the people who practice it or the animals they practice it with, for example, if it correlated with some form of mental illness for the person or physical trauma for the animal, then an argument could be made that bestiality is wrong in the same way that murder and stealing are. As it stands, the evidence for this proposition is incomplete at best. I'm the Erudite Kynophile, signing out.